Morning, everybody. Programming Logic, Unit 2, Lesson 1, and we're going to have a look at the basics of arrays. So, before I start with arrays, let's just go and see why we use arrays. Assume that we need to get 5 numbers from the user, calculate the sum, and display it. So, up to now, we would write the code pretty much like this. We would define 5 variables as well as the sum. We will need to put 5 text boxes on the screen, get all the data, calculate the sum, and then display it. Pretty standard. But what now if I need to get 30 numbers or 60 numbers from the user? It's going to be really an impossible task if we use variables like this to store the data. Because every data item needs to be stored in a new variable. Just imagine a screen with 60 blocks on it. How that would look, where 60 numbers must be entered. Absolutely terrible. But luckily, we can solve that problem. We can define something that's called an array, where consecutive memory positions would be used to store the data. The nice thing is that one name is given to all of them. So this statement over here defines what is called an array. It's got 5 positions. The positions are numbered from 0 index to the last one, 4. And because we start the counting with 0, there would be 4 values, even if the highest subscript, highest index, would be 4. I've got 5 values. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 little blocks. Okay, so an array in short gives me one name for the memory positions. Exactly the same data would be stored in every position. So in this example, I specified that my array must store strings, but we can store double and integer, character and boolean just as well. Okay, we will mostly work with strings and integers in this example. So one name is given. I will specify what is the highest subscript, highest index in Visual Basic. That gives me always an array with one block, one element more than the highest, because we start counting at 0. So over here I defined that I would like to store 5 names. If we now go to the topics and the goals of today's lesson, then we first of all want to become familiar with arrays, know what it is, why it's used, etc. And then the very nice thing is that I can give you common array algorithms. So we will normally be able or want to do this and this and that with an array, and this is how we do it. These algorithms, you need to study them. You need to know them off by heart, because we will use them very, very much while dealing with arrays. So we had a look at why arrays first of all. It will really save me a lot of time if I can replace statements like this with the following statements. And over here, I'm just comparing the data. On the left hand side, no array is used. And on the right hand side, I'm using an array. Don't worry if the code looks intimidating. We're really going to have a good look at it. So instead of defining 5 different variables, I can define an array to store 5 values for me. I will now need to use input box to get my data. I'm not going to use separate text boxes anymore. But the nice thing is that I can use a loop. This loop goes from 0 to 4. The length of the array would be 5. 5 minus 1 would be 4. So a loop to store all my data. This counter that will start at 0 and then be 1, 2, and 3, and 4 will indicate the position where the data would be stored in the array. And I can again use a loop to calculate the sum for me and display it. But we're going to have a detailed look at all of the things that we can do with arrays. So first of all, why an array? Because it's going to make me as a programmer, my life really a lot easier. What are arrays? It's sequences of values of the same type. So an array would only store strings or only store integers. It will have a fixed number of elements. So if I create it with, let's say, 5 elements, 5 blocks, that's the number of blocks that it would have. So, and it's got consecutive memory positions. So in the memory of the PC, it's going to occupy the next and the next and the next slot for us. And then, very important that you see just now, we're going to use an index, a subscript, to access the individual array elements. And now strings were a terrific example of something very similar to an array. If I had a word, then those characters in the word had 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 as 0, 1, 2, 3. Let's maybe put this in Notepad. Then it's a little bit easier for you to see the difference. There we go. So, a string is very similar to an array. We can actually use a string as a character array, and I'll show that a little bit later to you. If I had a string word, then the positions of the characters were W at position 0, O at position 1, and the string had a length as well. The length was 4 in this instance. So the last index or subscript would be given by length minus 1. Again, because we start with a 0 as the index. Okay, so arrays, very, very similar to indexes. Arrays, very, very similar to strings in the way that we handled it now. There's 2 links that we can go have a look at. I'm going to use the tutorials point link quite a little bit. If we go to it, then they will tell me an array stores a fixed size sequence, sequential collection, so one after the other, elements of the same type. It stores a collection of data. Very important, it's consecutive, or then another word, continuous memory location, so one after another. And the lowest, that address, tells me where to find the data, and the index tells me which value I really want to work with. So I've got quite a few examples that we're going to have a look at. before we go have a look at the examples, let's just see what we need to know. We first of all need to know how to declare an array, that dim statement that we need to use. How would that work? And there's two ways to declare an array. Either an empty array filled with zeros when I've got numbers and other data depending on the type of the length that we specified, or I can specify I want an array with initial data. For example, the names of the days of the week or the months, etc. So the first thing we need to do with an array is to declare it. Then very often we will need to accept data, input into the array if we didn't start with initial data. And for now we're going to only work with arrays where we all at once get all the data. So we're going to use always a counter-controlled loop. For loop is the easiest. I won't be able to use a text box anymore. Text box only gives me one value. I need many different values now. So we're going to use the input box function of VB.NET. In general programming, I'm just going to use it a dialog box. I will need to display the array data. Again, we're going to work with displaying all the values all at once. And again, we can use a for loop. We've got a choice between either a counter-controlled loop, the for loop that you know of, or we're going to learn a new for loop statement in VB, enhanced for loop. Easiest would be to display all the data in a list box. I can't just assign the data to a single label straight away because it's not going to show all my data. I can concatenate the data to a label, or I can also use a dialog box in VB.NET message box, most probably. But easiest would be to display all the data in a list box. When I access an array element, I always need the name of the array and the index that I want to use. Name of the array, we're normally going to make something plural. And please just start it with AR. And we've got AR numbers or AR names or AR prices, anything like that, depending on the data that we need to store. My index of the array would always be from 0 to the highest subscript. And this highest subscript would be the value that I created the array with. Very important. If I try to access an element with a non-existing index, I'm going to have a big problem. We're going to have an exception. So, in this code over here, I've got only array elements 0 to 4. If I try to use an array with something like this, AR number with 9 for example, that's going to give me a problem because there is no such element. The array was created with 5 elements only, subscripts or indexes 0 to 4. So keep that in mind. Index value, very important. Things that I would need to be able to do with an array would be to access all the data, to use specific indexes. We'll look at those in a moment. Let's now first of all have a look at how I might use the array to store some data. So we assume we've created the array, dim array names with 5 elements as string, If my instruction now says store Sue in the first element, we're not accepting user data just because this is the first example. Then my code would look like this. That line says put Sue in array names, position 0, and that would do exactly that. Sue is stored. You can maybe say save everything. If I have as a second instruction store Ben in the last element, then that would be the value of Ben. I would also be able to do something like this. Last element can be accessed with AR names dot length -1. But let's just leave that for a moment. Let it be. So AR names, subscript 4, save Ben there. There we go. Pete in the second element. So I think you'd be able to pretty soon see exactly what we do. That would store Pete in the second element. If I want to store Mary in the third element, my code would look like this, and that would store Mary over there. If I now have a line that says I want to store John as the fourth element, then there we go. If I now go and store any data again in a position, then it overrides the previous data. So if I want to go store Andy in the second element, then Andy is stored and Pete is replaced with Andy. If I now want to display some data, for example the name of the second element, my code might look like this. And here we are displaying it in a list box. So I'm using the subscript for the second element. So the first thing that you need to notice here, very, very good, very definitely, is that the first element for us humans corresponds to position 0 for my array. Last element, that would be 4, second element would be 1. And these are just a few examples of how I would now use the data. If we go to tutorials, point to the different examples that we've got available over there, then please never do this. We're always going to specify the type. So over there I specify that I would like to store strings and 21 of them. This we can ignore for now. It's a two-dimensional array. We don't work with that initially. We only work with arrays that's got a single subscript. So that's called a one-dimensional array. I can initialize the data in the array when I declare the array. This I'm only going to do if I know the data off by hand, or off by heart initially. So things like the names of the days of the week, the names of the months that we're going to use, the maximum days of each month. Things like that I can store in the array initially. Take note, I don't need to specify a higher subscript number now. Visual Basic is going to count and automatically see, oh, there's 6 elements over there. Create an array with indexes 0 to 5. Over there, there's an array with quite a few different names, it seems. Okay, and we're not going to use the object class. So we're not going to do things like that. Very important now, next of all, the arrays can be accessed, processed using the index number of the array. So over here they again have a few examples, and you guys can go have a look at that. I've got my own examples that I would like to go through. Okay, so if we go have a look, users, humans, would always see the first data in a group as number 1, the second as number 2. Hey, that's what we used to. But arrays will store the first data at index 0 and the second data at index 1. So we need to be really careful about that. So keep in mind, whenever the human would give us a number, we would always need to subtract 1 in order to use that in an array. Let's say I've got another example that I quickly want to do. Display the element at index 3. So index is given to us, whatever the array name might be. Let's assume just 3. If I want to display it, let's just assume I've got a list box. Output dot items dot add, and go and display that there. Or if I get an instruction, store 55 at index 1, then let's say I've got an array of numbers. Index 1 stores 55. We saw how the indexes are used when I stored the different names as well. We're very seldom going to use it like this. We're very often going to use it in arrays, in loops, and that would be the next thing. Okay, so have a look. When I process an array, we very often will use a counter-controlled loop for most of the processing, and here are the different things that I need to be able to do with the loop when I process the arrays. So I might need to initialize the array with specific data, zeros or 10, 20, 30 or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I will need to accept from the user all the data to store in the array. Maybe I need to display all the array data, either from the start to the end or from the end to the start, reverse order. I might need to calculate the sum of the average of the data stored in the array. I might need to increase all the array data by a certain value, so fixed value like 5, or a percentage, 5%. My formula would be different. I very often need to find the highest or the lowest value, find the position of a specific value that I want to replace or display, or I might need to count matches. So that list is the list of things that we need to know about. We need to know exactly how to do all of these things. Other minor things would be to swap the array elements and to sort the array in ascending or descending order. We're also going to see that there's a new loop statement. It's called an enhanced for loop. And this loop is really created to use with arrays and other data structures. With this, I can access all the data in the array. Keep in mind, I cannot use the enhanced for loop to update or to change the data in an array. Before I start with the different array algorithms, just take note, very often I am asked to populate an array. If I just create an array, it would by default have starting values in Visual Basic. So for any number array like integers or doubles, it would store zeros. But maybe I'm asked to populate the array with specific data. I can do it at two places. Either at design time, so design time means while I'm coding, while I'm physically typing the program. That I can now do when I'm creating the array. And we saw an example over here. So this array is initialized or populated with starting data at design time. The programmer coded the starting values. Sometimes we can also go and populate an array at runtime, so while I'm executing the code. Then we need to use a loop. Okay, I want to now have a look at the different array algorithms. And you'll see these algorithms will help you tremendously. So there's quite a few algorithms and you need to know them. You need to know them very well. The algorithm itself is just the English type steps. For most of the code, will give you the Visual Basic example as well. So if I'm asked to initialize an array with specific data, let's say all the elements must store 10, for example, then the basic steps would be to traverse all the array from the start to the end. I'm going to assign the data to each array element and we will end the loop. So in Visual Basic, the code would look as follows if I want to assign zeros. And I'm just going to use array name. I've quickly changed some names. Okay. My array in all these examples would now be called AR numbers. So if I want to initialize an array with just zeros, my code would look like this. This algorithm is converted now to specific VB code. So if I want to traverse the array from the start, index 0, to the end, index length -1, and I assign 0 to each array element, that's how the code would look. If I need to assign 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to the different array elements, then I can take the counter and I can add 1 to it. So the first time this loop executes when count is 0, 1 will be stored, then 2, then 3. If I needed to, let's say, assign 10, 20, 30, 40 and so forth, I will need to change my formula. So for this example, I will add 1 to count, then multiply by 10, and then store the data in the array. So I sometimes will need to work on my formula that I need to use. So that would now be the algorithm to initialize the array with specific data. You need to know this algorithm off by heart. The algorithm can very often easily be translated to whatever programming language we use. So this algorithm will work in any programming language, whether I use VB or Java. The steps to initialize an array would always be traverse the array, go over the array from the start to the end, and assign the data. Next algorithm says populate an array with user data. Populate means to add new data to an array. And here we're going to assume the user is going to give us the data. So I want to store new data in the array. The algorithm would be to traverse the array again, accept the next value in the loop, and assign that next value to the specific array element. So if I've got a counter-controlled loop, I might have an input box to ask the user for a number. Take note, I can't use text box. Think quickly of your interface. Normally when we've got a text box on the screen, there would be a button and the user needs to click on the button to do a job. If I now code this loop in the button event procedure, then from the same text box, this loop is going to try and get many different values, and that's not possible. So when I use a loop and arrays, I will need to use input box. And either we can use just a bland type of message to the user, enter a number many different times. Every new number is first saved in a variable, and then the variable is saved in the array. This is just to make the code, shall I say, easier for beginners. I'll show you an example 3 just now. This is a little bit nicer. It's where I'm going to display enter, and I most probably will change this message to enter number 1, enter number 2. Hey? Count plus 1, so initially that would be 1, because 0 plus 1 is 1. So instead of asking the user enter number 0 the first time around, I ask the user enter number 1, enter number 2, enter number 3, and then I save the number. This is perfectly fine for beginners, so you can keep to that. Little bit more experienced programmers will most probably do something like that immediately. So, save the data directly in the array. And this is also perfectly fine. It depends on what you are comfortable with. So initially you might be comfortable with that, but after you now used arrays for a week or 2 weeks, you might see that you change your code to something like this. Next algorithm, I would like to display the data in the array from the start to the end. So again, I will need to traverse the array, display the array element, end the loop. And over here I've got one example where we just display the data in a list box. And example 2 pops over to the new line, so let's just do something like that. And over here we can see the for each loop first time around. With the for each loop, we specify for every number in array numbers, and number is now defined as a variable, one variable of the same type of data that the array stores. And the loop just says for each number in array numbers, go and display it. So for each loop is a little bit nice because it doesn't let the programmer worry about the indexes. But I can only use it to traverse the array, to go over the array if I want to. Just use the data. I can't update the data in the array with a for each loop. Just a second example. So, for each loop, very, very helpful. If I want to display the array data in reverse order, I need to use a counter-controlled loop. So now I will traverse the array from the end to the start and display all the array elements. This algorithm is rather simple still. I will go from the last element to the first element, and now I need to include the step -1 because we need to count down. And for this type of loop I can't use a for each statement. For each can't do that. Calculate the sum. So I need to be able to calculate the sum, the algorithm given to you, as well as a VB example. Take note that I can code the formula to calculate the sum either like this or like that. Perfectly fine either way. And we'd be able to use the enhanced for loop as well. Calculate the average. Now my algorithm gets a little bit more complicated. I will first need to calculate the sum. So this first part, exactly the same. Then I need to calculate the average and take care that it happens A after the loop and B only if I don't have an empty array. I can't have division by 0 in programming. So I need to test, is my array empty or not? Just move to the next page. So for now, array length, if that is 0, then average is just 0. Otherwise, average would be sum divided by whatever the name of the array would be. Let's just, I see I need to update this a little bit. There we go. Array numbers must be used. So, for loop to calculate the sum, I start with a sum of 0. I need to initialize the sum to 0 before the loop. After the loop, I calculate the average only if I've got data, because division by 0, a big no-no. Then I need to be able to increase all the array data by a certain value. So I presume we need to get the data, traverse the array, add the value to each array element. Or then, if I need to increase the data by a percentage, I will need to calculate the percentage value first. So if we have a look at the two examples, over here we assume we're going to increase all the numbers by 5. So I need a loop to traverse all the data, and I can't use the enhanced for loop. I'm going to take the original value, add 5 to it, and store it back in its position. If I need to increase the array by, let's say, 10%, for beginners might be a little bit easier if we first go and calculate the increased value and then add that to the array, or then leave the code as a third example where we do everything all at once. So apologies. I'll fix it now. There we get. Okay, so example 3 now. I've got a loop. I take my original value. I'm adding the percentage that I'm increasing it with. And if I've got just a 10 like that, I will need to divide by 100, to calculate the percentage. Now my formula is correct. Either I can do it in 2 steps. First go and calculate the increased value, and then add the increased value to the array element and store it back in its original position, or do everything in one long line, depending on your capabilities and what you are most comfortable with. Very often we need to find the highest value in all the data stored in an array. And now my algorithm, really important, I'm really right at the start going to assume the first element's data would be the highest. So assign the first element to a new variable called highest. Then I need to traverse the array. I don't need to go from the start. I need to go from the first element. From the second element, start plus 1 to the end. I will test if my current element is bigger than highest. If it's so, I'm going to store the current element as the new highest value. After the loop, I can use the highest as I need to. So my VB code would look like this. Take the first element, store that in highest. Have a loop that doesn't start at 0 now, but at 1. Go to the end of the array still. Test if array numbers of the current value count is bigger than highest. There's a spelling mistake. If so, then save it in highest. And after the loop, use highest as is needed. I also need to do the lowest. And over here, the only thing that's different is my comparison sign. I need to check now for a smaller number. Sometimes we almost at the end, I need to be able to find the position of a specific value. So get the data from the user. And now very important, -1 tells me no data found. So I'm going to assign -1 to the position. I'm going to traverse my array from the start to the end. I need a counter-controlled loop for this. I'm going to test if my current array element is equal to the value that I need to find. If so, I'm going to store the position. After the loop, I can test the position. If it's still -1, then I didn't find the data. Otherwise, I did found the data and I can do whatever processing is needed. So, in my VB example, I'm going to assume the user typed the value that I need to find in a text box. We're converting it. That's a little bit wrong. In VB, it's a function call that looks like that. I'm going to assign -1 to the position. I've got a loop and it must be a counter-controlled loop. I'm going to test if my current value is equal to whatever I need to find. If it is so, I will assign the counter value to position. And after the loop, I test, is position still -1? Then I do whatever I need to do when the data is not found. Maybe display an error message to the user. Otherwise, I do whatever I need to do when the data is found. Maybe display the data to the user. Count matches. So now I need to know how many, and in this example, 5s are stored in my array. So I will need to accept the value to count the matches of. I will need a special new counter that I will start at 0. Again, I will traverse the array. I'm going to test if my current element would be equal to the value that I need to find. I will need to increment my counter, and after the loop I can use or display the counter as I need to. So again, just before the loop, I will need to accept from the user the value that I need to find. You can add that one there. So assume now that we need a 5 from the user, or the user wants us to find how many 5s are stored. Before the loop I start at 0. I've got my loop. I can also use an enhanced for loop for this. Over there I test. If it is equal, I increment count match to 1 with 1, and after the loop I can use my counter as I want to. So there were so many 5s in the array. Might be the message that I display to the user. Take note that this if statement might depend on whatever data we need to find. So if the user, for example, asks me to find how many 5 to 8 numbers are saved in the array, then I will need to update this condition just with the values that I need to find. Okay, and that's all of them. That's quite a few different algorithms. These algorithms are really needed. You need to know them. If I wake you up middle of the night, you need, and I ask you what is the algorithm to count the matches, you need to give it to me, because these algorithms will assist you in using arrays. So if I can recap, the array algorithms, that's given extremely important because this will assist you with arrays. I showed you the algorithm itself, so the English words, you need to know them, and I showed you how it would be implemented in VB. We saw a new loop statement, an enhanced for loop. This loop statement can access all the data in the array. I can't use it for updates or changes. Or if I need to get the data in other sequence than from the start to the end. If we can have a look at the syntax of the for each statement. So they tell us this loop can traverse each element in a collection. So an array is an example of a collection, not the only one. It's your first example. So it's used to access and manipulate all the elements in an array. And there are an example. For each, I'll give it a name. I can add the as integer or as string over here in and the array name. I'll have my statements, leave the rest, and then just a next right at the end. There's some examples that you can go and have a look at. We need to know how to populate an array right at the start. I can either do it at design time while I'm creating the array with the specific data, or at runtime, and then I'm going to use a loop to store certain data in the array. The only other array processing that we need to know about would be how to swap array elements and how to sort the array in ascending or descending order. For this example, I'm going to go back to our string array. I'm just going to enhance that a little bit, make it a little bit smaller. So let's assume I want to swap the first and the last elements in the array. What are we going to do about that? I will first of all need a temporary variable. Then I'm going to store the last value in the first element, and right at the end I will need to store the temporary variable in the last element. It's going to work like this. So let's assume I have one variable, maybe a little bit bigger so that it can store the data, and this is called temp. So if I need to now swap the first and the last elements, then my first statement, let's just see what it would do, and then I will add the Visual Basic code. Store the first element in a temporary variable, so store Sue. Then I store the last element in the first element, so take Ben and store Ben over there, and right at the end I store the temporary variable in the last value, and this will swap the data for me. So my code would look like this. Temp is equal to, in this case, array names, and I need to store the first element. Then I will store the last element in the first element, so array names 0 index. Your data gets replaced by index 4's data, and then right at the end array names, you get your new data from temp. So in essence I go and store this value just in a separate little variable where I need to save my data. If I need to sort the data in ascending sequence, and it's just a simple array like this, it's really easy. There's a class in Visual Basic called arrays, and it's got a sort method, and I can send my array to it. This will now sort all the data in ascending sequence. Ascending means from A to Z. If I need to sort the data in descending sequence, then again, not so difficult. Descending sequence, so descending means from Z to A, and in Visual Basic I'm going to do it as follows. First I'm going to sort the array in ascending sequence, and then there's a method called reverse that reverses the order. So in Visual Basic I will first sort in ascending sequence, and then thereafter reverse the order of the data in the array. Okay, I am going to do the planning of a program that uses arrays in the next example, next video. Thank you then very much. I hope this was helpful.